Real-Life Spectroscopy, Forensic Science by Hailey and Justine.
Officer Speck was called to investigate a crime scene in the park. When he arrived, he observed a trail of blood leading down a path. He knew something bad had happened, and when he took another look around the scene, he happened upon the most important piece of evidence he would find: a gun. Hopefully, Officer Speck thought to himself, the suspect wasn't wearing gloves and left some fingerprints behind. If there were fingerprints, he could take the evidence to Dr. Infrared, his colleague in the lab, who would be able to analyze the fingerprints along with the chemical traces in them. As he was investigating the evidence, Officer Speck also found a strand of jet black hair on the gun.
When Officer Speck got back to the station, he went to the lab to meet with Dr. Infrared and explain the situation to her. Thanks for bringing this to me, Speck. I'm going to go analyze the evidence and I'll let you know what I found.
Dr. Infrared started by determining if there were even any fingerprints on the gun at all. She did this by dusting a powder over the common places people hold a gun. She happened to find multiple fingerprints, but unfortunately, none could be fully obtained.
Once she found the fingerprints, Dr. Infrared got Officer Speck to search the system for any matching prints. It looks like we have 2 matches, said Officer Speck.
These people have been arrested before. Joseph was arrested 4 years ago for burglary and released shortly after for good behavior, and Clyde was arrested 5 years ago for possession of drugs and explosives and released a year after Joseph for the same reason. According to their files, they are both left-handed and they both used to smoke. Knowing both sets of prints were of interest, Dr. Infrared went back to the lab to look for traces.
She began by spraying the prints with solvent droplets to isolate any chemicals. When the solvent droplets dried, Dr. Infrared was left with a film that contained the material present in each set of fingerprints. With 2 possible suspects, Dr. Infrared hoped she would be able to narrow it down to one after completing her analysis.
To analyze them, she began by doing infrared spectroscopy and using the different sebum associated with each set of prints. To clarify, sebum is a substance produced by the sebaceous glands located in the skin tissue to regulate homeostasis. The substance is made up of about 57% triglycerides and fatty acids, which gives it an oily appearance. It also contains ester waxes and squalene. In short, sebum is what allows for a replica of the fingerprint to be transferred to a surface.
When the IR spectrum was complete, Dr. Infrared was able to determine traces of oxybenzone, a key ingredient in sunscreen, nicotine, and ammonium nitrate, a highly explosive chemical when mixed or contaminated with combustible materials. Because sunscreen is a typical lotion for almost everyone to apply, Dr. Infrared ignored the finding. However, the traces of nicotine and ammonium nitrate were of high interest to her. Because the nicotine confirmed that the suspect was a smoker, and since there were only traces of the chemical on the left-hand fingerprints, the suspect was also confirmed to be left-handed. With traces of ammonium nitrate, it was evident that the suspect had been handling explosives shortly before committing the crime. Because Clyde was the only suspect known to have previously worked with explosives, the trace led to him becoming the prime suspect. Even though Dr. Infrared uses only infrared spectroscopy in this case, it is important to note that a mass spectrometry can be used in place of infrared to carry out the same analysis to determine the chemicals present in fingerprints. The reasons Dr. Infrared uses IR spectroscopy instead of mass spectrometry in this case is because it is less invasive and destructive, meaning the fingerprints are not disturbed and could be analyzed again at a later date.
Having narrowed it down to a prime suspect, Dr. Infrared again used infrared spectroscopy, this time applying the ATR technique to analyze a strand of jet black hair. She first determined that the strand was of human and not animal nature by observing the intensities and peaks found in the spectrum. This was necessary because Officer Speck had found the gun in a park where there are many animals roaming around. Dr. Infrared further analyzed the spectrum and realized that the strand of hair contained ethynylamine, p-aminophenol, and p-phenylenediamine. After doing a bit of research on these chemicals and referencing literature spectra for different hair dyes, Dr. Infrared determined that her spectrum corresponded to just for men dye. It is interesting to note that IR spectroscopy, using the ATR technique, allows scientists like Dr. Infrared to identify something as specific as a brand of hair dye simply by analyzing the composition and intensities of the peaks in a spectrum. Because Clyde was the only suspect known to use hair dye, Dr. Infrared had found more evidence to prove that he was the offender.
Considering everything previously known about the 2 criminals, and now the traces of ammonium nitrate and chemicals present in hair dye, Dr. Infrared informed Officer Speck that the offender was Clyde. If it wasn't for Dr. Infrared using spectroscopy to analyze the hair strand and the fingerprints, they wouldn't have known that the suspect had dyed hair and that they had handled explosives. Without this knowledge, it would have been difficult to confirm the suspect. Thanks to infrared spectroscopy, another case was solved by Dr. Infrared, Officer Speck, and science.